Welcome back to the Vocal Alchemists podcast. This is episode 2, The Power of Words. If you missed the first episode, make sure you go listen to that, where I introduced myself and explained my background in music and vocal studies, as well as my personal spiritual evolution and how I became a certified yoga teacher and a lot more. If you are watching on YouTube, you'll see a visual presentation to go along with today's episode since there is a lot of information to go over. So you're welcome, visual learners. Today's topic is all about the power of words. We're going to touch on the philosophy of communication, etymology, affirmations, mantras, and cultural connections. To start out the episode, I want to offer you an invitation for reflection with one question. How do your words shape your reality? Think about it, and here we go. Today's topic is an interesting one since in order to create this podcast and explain my thoughts to you, I have to use verbal language, so it's kind of ironic. It's hard to notice the role that language plays in our culture, thoughts, and actions. Talking about this with verbal language is like trying to see the mirror that we use to see everything else. Plus, I only speak English, so I am bound to the confines of one specific language, but I'm going to try my best to convey my ideas in the purest way possible. We don't usually tend to think about the power of our words, but verbal language is so important in our day-to-day lives. We take this gift of language and communication for granted. There are so many ways that language is embedded in our daily lives, from literature, song lyrics, poetry, theater and film, and so much more. Yes, there are times when words can't be found to describe an experience or a feeling, but oftentimes words, in any of the forms I just mentioned, help one to assess the life around them. So, when we're talking about philosophy of communication, I'm assuming you know what philosophy is, but what is communication? Well, it is a tool that is a means to convey something about the environment to others. Communication is most effective when received by the recipient without any distortion. Distortion is where misunderstandings come from. Communication through verbal language bridges the gap between our inner thoughts and the world around us. Verbal language gives humans an advanced way of communicating aside from body language or actions. So we're a bit ahead of other animals on this planet because of verbal language, I believe. At their core, words are literally just sounds. And in the first episode, we talked about sound as vibration. So sound is vibration, energy, and resonance. So next, I want to get deeper into the philosophy of communication, and I'm utilizing notes from my philosophy of communication course from college, so I'm going to try to put as much as I can on the visual representation, because I feel like it'll make it easier to follow. But the first philosopher I want to discuss is Walker Percy. About this topic, he wrote that humans are always using language to interpret, understand, and find meaning in our experiences. If we think we can imagine raw life experience without linguistic interpretation, we are mistaken. Because once we talk, we live in a linguistic world. Yet, we don't remember developing language. Not only on an individual level, I don't know about you, but I don't remember actually learning to speak as a baby, but even as a human race, the beginning of human language was the beginning of history. Not in a literal sense, but after the development of verbal language is when we began to write about life experiences. So the next philosopher I want to discuss is Martin Heidegger. He was concerned with hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation, especially the interpretation of biblical texts, wisdom literature, and philosophical texts. More on hermeneutics later, but each person has their own unique experiences, beliefs, and desires, which Heidegger would call foreconceptions. And side note, if anyone has read the book The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, I like to think of like our foreconceptions as similar to our agreements, if you know what I'm talking about. But anyways, Heidegger argues that foreconceptions always play a role in the process of understanding, and that to fully understand a text, one must test their own foreconceptions. He writes that we have a totality in view in advance of interpreting any given thing, like symbols, for example, a stop sign. This begs the question, if I'm always interpreting in terms of something I already have in mind, is this really understanding? Or is it just a vicious circle? Well, in my philosophy of communication class, we analyzed Heidegger's writing and determined that no, to say that foreconceptions are always present when we go to understand is not to say that our thoughts only serve the purpose of feeding our foreconceptions. The process of thinking includes self-reflection, in which we revisit and reassess the meanings, frameworks, and beliefs that we previously used to make sense of things. To speak more on the hermeneutic tradition or the hermeneutic theory of understanding, understanding is an ongoing process. One is never done understanding a book or any text. In turn, an object becomes more understood over time. If we have different foreconceptions, we have different understandings of a text. Yet, as long as the reading leads to the critical reevaluation of that person's foreconceptions, then that reading is one that produces understanding. The last thing I wanted to touch on with the philosophy of communication is the demand to write. We turn to writing when we feel the need to process something that we've experienced. Writing is not simply about expressing experiences to others, but transforming the meaning of these experiences. Writing can also be a way of working through loss or other sad things. Maurice Blanchot, I probably am saying that wrong, I'm sorry. He is a philosopher who was inspired by literature written by survivors of the Holocaust and also by his own near-death experience. And he said that survivors were not simply narrating, because psychologically returning to the scene is somewhat impossible. They were pouring themselves into writing because it was an inner demand, a need to transform the experience they had. One poet and Holocaust survivor we looked at was Paul Celan, whose poetry shows him straining to even find the words, or to find meaning or a continuous memory amidst the trauma and loss. The question is, why did he pour himself into writing? Why not just say that words can't express it? Why is it so important for us to write and use our words? Think about this. For the next segment, I want to get into the idea of words as spells and etymology. But first, I need to introduce the idea of how our thoughts create our reality, and also why our thoughts are the same as our words. So the funnel is as follows. Our environment affects our beliefs and perceptions, which then forms our thoughts and words, which in turn determines the nature of our entire reality. So thoughts are just words inside of your head, or, it can also be general feelings or pictures, but usually words are associated. But underneath these thoughts are our life experiences. Our surroundings or environment can determine much of our life experiences. So our environment affects our perception, and our perception affects our thoughts and therefore our words. Because usually when you speak, you think first and then you say it out loud. I mean, there's a whole saying, like, think before you speak, The thoughts we think in our head determine our mood and how we live our life and show up in the world. Our words that we share with others out loud determine how we connect with the people around us. Therefore, our entire reality can change if we first change our thoughts and words. And then, because of that funnel, this obviously involves adjusting our environment and perception. Now, a very general surface level example, but think of two hypothetical children. One of them grew up in a healthy home, and the other child did not. In our example, the child brought up in a loving, healthy home with kind words grows into a healthy individual. Some beliefs that child may hold could be, I matter, I can do great things, etc. Versus the ones who aren't as fortunate. They grow up, in a tumultuous or even abusive home. These folks will struggle in life. Usually, not always, therapy, etc. can help. But some beliefs that child may have, is no one cares, I need to be seen and not heard, or I can't chase my dreams, etc. This affects everything in our life, how we interact with others, how we see our place in the world, and all of that. Of course, nothing is so black and white, but you get the gist. This is why the idea of gentle parenting is so popular on TikTok and the internet these days. We are breaking cycles of generational trauma and taking back our power, and part of that is obviously through kind language. If you still don't see how powerful our words are, I don't know what to tell you, for real. But okay, listen, this next part is a bit woo-woo, but maybe it will connect some dots for you. So etymology is the study of the origin of words and the way in which their meanings have changed throughout history. Oftentimes when you break down the etymological meaning of a word, you find out it originally meant something else. So basically our words are spells. Think, literally, the word spelling. This is because of the intention behind what we say. Language can either uplift or harm. It's kind of obvious. Being kind versus throwing insults, But, for example, cursing. Think about it. The word itself literally says you are cursing someone. Quoted in the Medium, Professor Dr. Mike Zim is quoted saying the following. In the Indo-European tradition, words were always viewed as having magical abilities or possessing a dangerous magic. For example, the daughter languages of Proto-Indo-European arranged the consonants in the root for the animal wolf in bizarre ways. This is probably because the original speakers feared that if they said the actual word for wolf, it would magically cause the animal to appear. It's the origin of curse words, the belief that the usage of particular words had powerful negative effects, the ability to curse yourself or others, end quote. So think about the literal and energetic implications of negative speech. When we use negative language, it harms others in a literal sense, but it also energetically affects everyone involved in a situation. Our words are more powerful than we even think. This is why affirmations work. And this actually segues me into my next point, which is that affirmations and mantras are not the same thing. So, the difference between affirmations and mantra. Affirmations are a scientifically backed method of reprogramming our thoughts or our mind. They are positive, intentional statements to rewire thought patterns, and they work by using the voice as a tool for reprogramming the mind. In a future episode, I'll discuss more about affirmations and choosing not to say negative things because words are energy carriers. It's something that I'm always working on, you know. It's definitely some sort of societal programming to say, you know, negative things sometimes about yourself or others, and we often don't even actually mean these little things. We'll talk about it more later, but that's basically affirmations, you know. I feel like a lot of people who tune into this are going to be pretty familiar with the idea of affirmations. But contrastingly, mantras are sacred sounds created by ancient Indian yogis, meaning a statement or affirmation in English is not a mantra. That's the big main point here, because people misuse it all the time. Personally, I am currently only familiar with Sanskrit mantras. This is what I studied in my yoga teacher trainings. While most commonly found in Sanskrit, mantras can also be found in languages like Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, and more. In Sanskrit, mantra means the thought that liberates and protects. And Sanskrit is actually believed to be the original language, but it is not a conversational language, and it never was. It was made specifically for sacred purposes. Reciting mantras is often rooted in spiritual or meditative practices. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. The power of mantra actually lies in the vibrations themselves. The energetic resonance of sound itself is the key, regardless of linguistic meaning. Mantra connects you to the same vibrations that yogis have been chanting for centuries. Chanting mantras creates new neural pathways in the brain, even without knowing the meaning in Sanskrit. But also, translating them and studying them that way is also really fun too. But you don't actually have to understand the meaning for these sounds to, you know, have great transformations, you know, in your life or in your inner world. So, yeah, mantra is a form of sound healing, actually. So, anyone who has chanted or listened to it can attest to that. The most simple mantra to start with is Om. I'm sure you've heard it. Om is actually the sound of the universe. You begin with an inhale and then exhale on an open ah, change the vowel to an o, and then land on a at the end. So the vowel should be held out longer than the An example of what an om sounds like would be Now I invite you to join me on this next om. I promise you it feels wonderful. So here we go. Inhale. And there is a side note, there is a practice that I would like to do pretty soon with local alchemists where I lead 108 ohms. We'll talk about that when it actually comes, but look forward to that because I feel like it's cool and fun, and it's a little bit weird Well, some people might think it's weird. I don't, but I just think it's cool. Um, because this vibration connects you to all that is. Other mantras are longer and can span from one phrase to dozens of lines of verses. But yeah, we'll talk more about mantras in future episodes, definitely. But my main point for this one is that both mantras and affirmations can be helpful tools, but in the Western world, many people misuse the word mantra. So we must think about the implications of misusing the word mantra, because to me, it's no laughing matter. It's serious. So now that you know the difference between these two tools, you can utilize both to your advantage and also educate others when they misuse the word mantra. So I wanted to wrap up the podcast with one last segment about cultural connections. Because in every single civilization across the planet, they have some sort of verbal language, obviously. And in every place across the world, words play such an important role. But today, I'd like to specifically take a moment to discuss indigenous perspectives on sacred speech and storytelling. And now this is a quote from the Smithsonian, since I like how they put it, and they can probably explain it better than I could, But, quote, Indigenous peoples have strong storytelling traditions. Histories, stories, and religious rites were and are passed from the memories of one generation to the next through the spoken word. The oral tradition connects past, present, and future, and tightens tribal and familial bonds. These oral traditions can provide moral lessons and communicate creation stories, cultural beliefs, and personal, family, or tribal history and experiences. Creation stories actually are often sacred and only told through the oral tradition. So, quote, think about that. That's beautiful. I just think that we could learn a lot from these perspectives. But the quote continues, language loss was part of the systemic destruction or assimilation of native peoples. Some languages have vanished completely, while many others are weakened. Elders believe if the language is lost, the people will be too. Teachers, elders, and linguists have been working to capture native speech in written form through online classes and in language school nests as a way to pass on the languages and cultures to younger generations. End quote. If words weren't important, the powers that be wouldn't want to destroy these ancient sacred verbal practices or take indigenous people's native tongue away from them. So, uplifting the voices of the various indigenous communities is crucial. This is something I deeply, deeply believe in. Now, to wrap up the cultural connections segment, I wanted to bring up Christianity. And I know how difficult it is for some people to discuss Christianity or whatever. For the record, I'm not a Christian or here to promote any religion, as I don't personally adhere to any particular one. In fact, in the first episode, I touched on how I used to be an atheist, but no longer am. But anyway, I like to look at all sorts of cultures and religions to analyze their practices, because I have an endless curiosity about the world, essentially. So in every religion, they have some sort of sacred book of words. In Christianity, there is a verse in the Bible, John 1:1, which says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I'm pretty sure they're using words as a metaphor for Jesus, but it also seems like in their belief, the creator of the universe created all of this with just his words. So I just think it's cool and just something I wanted to share. I'm not going to get deep into like theological whatever, but I just want us to think about like, what do these cultural connections teach us about the sacredness of our words and our voices? So that about wraps up everything that I have for you today. I really appreciate you if you listened till the end. I know that especially the beginning with the philosophy stuff, it was like a lot of information that I was kind of going through pretty quickly. But I do kind of want to keep these episodes under like 30 minutes, so I don't want them to be too long unless I'm having some sort of interview or something. But yeah, that's about all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening, and I do have some last questions for reflection. So please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and share this video or share the Spotify link if that's where you're listening. Subscribe on YouTube at Vocal Alchemists. But the questions for reflection are the following. 1 is, how can you be more intentional with your words? And 2 is, how do you use your voice to express truth? Thank you so much again for listening, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.